Have you ever noticed how the weather changes before a storm? The sky turns heavy, the air goes still, and you just know something's coming. That's what our markets feel like right now. Uneasy, weighted, the Fed's cutting rates again, saying everything's fine. But when every cut feels like a rescue, you've got to wonder, rescue from what? After decades of watching Washington and Wall Street waltz, I've learned one thing. The music always stops for a reason. And what Jerome Powell isn't saying out loud might be that reason. The Fed just dropped its benchmark rate to 4%. The news called it a quarter-point adjustment, like it's routine. But this isn't a victory lap. It's a retreat. For nearly 3 years, they've been pulling money out of the system, shrinking their balance sheet to tame inflation. Now, they've quietly announced that tightening ends December 1st. Not because they've won, but because something's starting to crack. They call themselves data-dependent, but this move wasn't about data. It was about fear, the same fear that gripped them in 2019, when overnight lending rates spiked to 10%, and the system nearly froze. They remember that night, and the warning lights are flashing again. Here's the heart of it. Money is draining from the banking system through two leaks at once. Either one alone would be manageable, but both together? That's when you call the plumber in a panic. And right now, America's financial plumbing is rumbling. The first leak is the Treasury General account, the government's checking account at the Fed. Since summer, it's ballooned by over $600 billion. Every time Washington collects taxes or issues new debt, that cash gets pulled out of private banks and parked at the Fed. In plain terms, that's $600 billion sucked out of circulation and locked in a vault. The second leak is the reverse repo facility. For months, it acted like a shock absorber, a place where money market funds could park their cash overnight. But that cushion's gone flat. Balances have dropped sharply, and the safety valve that used to relieve pressure is almost empty. Put those two together, and you've got a double squeeze. Cash is draining through one pipe while the backup tank runs dry. Bank reserves, the money banks actually use to lend to each other overnight, are falling fast. And when reserves get tight, the whole system starts to creak. You can see it in SOFR, the Secured Overnight Financing Rate. Basically, the system's blood pressure. Lately, it's spiked. That's the market's way of shouting, there's not enough cash to go around. The Fed knows that signal. They've seen it before. It means we've gone from ample reserves to merely adequate. And adequate is just another word for fragile. That's why Powell blinked. That's why the rate cuts and the sudden end to all balance sheet reduction. Because he remembers 2019, when overnight lending rates shot from 2% to 10%, banks froze, and the Fed had to pump in emergency cash just to keep the gears turning. They've seen this movie before, and they know how fast it can unravel. Why did it happen? Same reason it's threatening to happen now. The Fed had been shrinking its balance sheet, pulling liquidity out of the system, and nobody realized how close to the edge we were until we went over it. Powell doesn't want a repeat. None of them do. That crisis was a humiliation. It showed that for all their models and forecasts, they'd lost track of how fragile the system really was. So now, at the first sign of stress, they're hitting the brakes. They're choosing to flood the system with liquidity before something critical breaks. But here's the trade-off nobody's talking about openly. By prioritizing financial stability, by making sure the markets don't seize up, they're sacrificing their fight against inflation. They're choosing short-term peace in the money markets over long-term price stability for American families. And that choice has consequences. Now, you might be thinking, okay, so the Fed's being cautious. What's the big deal? The big deal is what's hiding underneath all this caution. The real reason they're scared isn't just about overnight lending rates. It's about the bombs that are ticking in the system, just waiting for the wrong spark. And the biggest bomb, that's commercial real estate. Think about how much change after the pandemic. Millions of people started working from home. They never came back. Office buildings in major cities are half empty, sometimes worse. I've walked through downtown areas that used to buzz with life at lunchtime, and now they're ghost towns at noon. Those buildings are worth a fraction of what they used to be. But here's the problem. They're still carrying debt based on the old valuations. Billions upon billions of dollars in loans, written when those buildings were full and interest rates were near zero. And now, those loans are coming due. There's what they call a maturity wall, a mountain of commercial real estate debt that needs to be refinanced in the next year or two. But you can't refinance a half-empty building at 6% interest when it was barely profitable at 2%. The math doesn't work. The collateral isn't worth enough. So what happens? Defaults, mass defaults. And who's holding all that debt? Not the big banks you hear about on TV. They're fine. It's the regional banks, the mid-sized institutions that are the backbone of lending in communities across America. They're the ones sitting on this commercial real estate time bomb. You remember earlier this year when a couple of regional banks failed? That was because of unrealized losses on treasury bonds, safe assets that lost value when interest rates went up. The banks were technically solvent, but they had a liquidity crisis and depositors panicked. Well, this next wave won't be about paper losses on safe bonds. This will be about real catastrophic losses on loans that can't be repaid. And the Fed knows it. That's why they're cutting rates now, even with inflation still running hot. They're trying to give these banks some breathing room, trying to let them extend those loans, pretend they're still good, and avoid a cascade of failures. It's what they call extend and pretend. You ever heard that phrase? It means kicking the can down the road, hoping something changes before you run out of road. But it's not just real estate. There's another problem sitting right next to it. For the past decade, America's been running on cheap money. Interest rates near zero meant companies could borrow almost for free. Some of them built real businesses with that money, but a lot of them, they just became what economists call zombie companies. These are corporations that don't make enough profit to cover their own interest payments. They survive by rolling over their debt, borrowing new money to pay off old loans over and over. As long as rates stayed low, they could keep the game going indefinitely. But that game's over now. Just like the commercial real estate loans, corporate debt is hitting its own maturity wall. Junk-rated companies, the risky ones, have hundreds of billions in bonds coming due, and they can't refinance at 5 or 6%. The numbers don't work. They'll default. And when they default, people lose jobs, unemployment spikes, and the Federal Reserve, with its dual mandate to keep prices stable and maximize employment, simply can't allow that. Not politically, not economically. So, once again, the Fed's hand is forced. They're not cutting rates because the economy's healthy. They're cutting rates because the economy they built, an economy addicted to cheap debt, is starting to go through withdrawal. And withdrawal can kill. Which brings us to the central irony of this whole situation. The contradiction that nobody in power wants to say out loud. The Federal Reserve is cutting interest rates right now, making money cheaper, making borrowing easier. And they're doing this while inflation is running at 3%, a full percentage point above their target, and accelerating. Let me say that again because it's worth sitting with. They are making monetary policy easier at the exact moment when prices are rising too fast. That's like turning up the heat because your house is already too hot. How do they justify it? Well, publicly they're clinging to the word transitory again. Remember that? They used it in 2021 to describe inflation that turned out to be anything but temporary. Now it's back. They're suggesting these price pressures are just bumps, temporary obstacles on the road back to 2%. Their other excuse is the labor market. They point to signs that employment might be weakening, though the data's been choppy and contradicted by other reports, and say they need to cut rates to support jobs. But here's what that really means. It means the Fed has quietly changed its priority. Price stability, keeping inflation at 2%, has taken a back seat. The new priority is market stability. Keep the financial system functioning. Keep asset prices elevated. Keep the game going. And they're not even pretending to have confidence anymore. At his last press conference, when a reporter pressed Powell about the Fed's credibility, about how they've been promising to hit 2% inflation in about 2 years for 4 straight years now, Powell basically admitted defeat. He said, and I'm paraphrasing, that nobody really knows where the economy will be in 3 years, and that their forecasts are just theoretical exercises to show a plausible path. Think about that. The chairman of the Federal Reserve, the most powerful economic institution in the world, essentially said, "We're guessing." He used the analogy of driving in fog. When you can't see, you slow down. Well, that's honest at least. But it's also terrifying. Because if they're driving in fog and they're slowing down by cutting rates while inflation's still burning, what happens when the fog lifts and they see they've been driving toward a cliff? Now, there's been some delay in getting clear data. The government had a brief shutdown, and some key reports got held up. The September Consumer Price Index, important labor market numbers. So, the Fed, which keeps telling us they're data dependent, is making these massive decisions while flying blind. That's given Powell some cover. He's been very careful not to promise another rate cut in December. The market's betting there's a 90% chance, but he's pushed back, saying there are strongly differing views within the committee. Some Fed members think they've already cut enough. That 4% is close to what they call the neutral rate, somewhere between 3 and 4%, where policy neither helps nor hurts the economy. But here's what I think is really happening. This isn't a one-time adjustment. This is a 3-act play, and we're only in Act 2. Act 1 was the initial rate cuts, the Fed admitting they'd gone too far with tightening. Act 2, happening right now, is ending quantitative tightening on December 1st. They're stopping the withdrawal of liquidity, halting the shrinkage of that $6.5 trillion balance sheet. And Act 3, that's coming in 2026, and it's the big one. That's when the Fed will be forced to turn the money printers back on. Full-throated quantitative easing, buying bonds by the hundreds of billions, flooding the system with newly created dollars. Why am I so sure? Because something's going to break. That commercial real estate time bomb we talked about, or a wave of regional bank failures, or a corporate debt crisis that sends unemployment spiking. One of these dominoes will fall, and when it does, the Fed will have no choice. They'll do what they always do. They'll bail out the system with freshly printed money. It won't be proactive. It'll be reactive. They'll wait until the crisis is undeniable, and then they'll act. And when they do, it'll make the pandemic money printing look restrained by comparison. So, what does all this mean for regular people? For families trying to make ends meet? For folks thinking about buying a home or retiring on their savings? Let's talk about the housing market, because that's where this policy hits home, literally. The housing market right now is sending mixed signals. If you're watching the national news, you'll hear conflicting stories. Some markets, particularly in the South, Florida, Texas, parts of the Southeast, have seen prices drop. Same story on the West Coast. But if you look at the Midwest and Northeast, prices are still climbing. So, is the market cooling or heating? Well, nationally, home prices are still up, about 1.7% over the past year. That's not a crash. That's not even a correction. That's a slowdown at best. The real relief people have felt is in mortgage rates. A year ago, rates were flirting with 8%. Today, the average 30-year fixed mortgage is closer to 6%. That's a meaningful difference when you're talking about a 30-year loan on $300,000, $400,000, $500,000. But here's something important to understand. That drop in mortgage rates, it didn't come from the Fed's quarter-point cut. Mortgage rates aren't tied to the Fed funds rate. They follow the 10-year Treasury bond. And the 10-year yield has been falling because the market is pricing in what comes next. Investors know the Fed is ending quantitative tightening. They know QE is coming back eventually. So they're front-running the policy, buying bonds now before the Fed starts buying them by the truckload. That buying pressure pushes bond prices up and yields down, and mortgage rates follow. So mortgage rates have dropped, not because things are good, but because the market expects things to get bad enough that the Fed will have to intervene. That's a crucial distinction. Now, here's the window of opportunity, and it's going to be brief. When the Fed launches that next big round of quantitative easing, probably sometime in 2026, Treasury yields will bottom out. For a few months, maybe just weeks, mortgage rates will hit their lowest point of this entire cycle. Anyone who owns a home and can refinance should jump on that window because it'll slam shut fast. Why? Because the money printing that pushes rates down initially will, after a lag, reignite inflation. And when inflation expectations take off again, bond yields will reverse course and spike. Mortgage rates will follow them right back up, probably higher than where they are now. This is why the people waiting for a housing crash like 2008 are likely to be disappointed. The Federal Reserve's entire playbook is designed to prevent asset price crashes. That's what all this is about. They'll print whatever money is necessary to keep housing prices elevated, to keep stock markets from tanking, to keep the wealth effect going. The outcome isn't a crash. The outcome is a permanent affordability crisis. Housing becomes something that stays expensive, that keeps rising over time, that moves further and further out of reach for the average family. Think about California and New York, places where ordinary people have been priced out of homeownership for years. That's not the exception anymore. That's becoming the national standard. And the Fed's policies are helping to make it so. Now, who benefits from that? Who wins when the Fed keeps printing money and propping up asset prices? Institutional investors, big corporations with access to cheap capital. They're the ones buying up residential properties by the thousands. They've got cash, they've got credit lines at the lowest rates, and they're turning single-family homes into rental properties. They're becoming the landlords for an entire generation that will never own. And it's not just housing. This same dynamic plays out across the entire economy. When the Fed does quantitative easing, it buys safe assets, treasury bonds, mortgage-backed securities. That drives up the prices of those bonds and pushes their yields down to almost nothing. Well, if you're a pension fund or a retiree trying to live off bond interest, that's a disaster. Your income collapses. So what do? You go searching for yield somewhere else. You move into riskier assets trying to get a decent return. And that's exactly what the Fed wants. They call it the search for yield. It's intentional. They push everyone out of safe, low-return investments and force them into stocks, real estate, private equity, anything that might generate a higher return. But here's the thing. That strategy works great if you've got money to invest. If you own stocks, if you own property, if you've got a portfolio, you do phenomenally well. The top 0.1%, the wealthiest of the wealthy, have seen their collective wealth nearly double since 2020. Almost all of that gain came from the stock market. The S&P 500 is near all-time highs right now. 2025 is on track to see a record $1.25 trillion flow into exchange-traded funds. Money is flooding into the market because everyone knows the Fed won't let it fall. They've created what people call the Fed put, an implicit promise that if stocks drop too far, the central bank will step in and rescue them. So, if you're wealthy, if you're retired with a solid nest egg, if you're a corporation with access to credit, this is a golden age. You borrow cheap, you invest in assets that the Fed is deliberately inflating, and you watch your wealth compound. But what if you're not in that group? What if you're young, just starting out, trying to build wealth from scratch? Then you're on the other side of the widest wealth gap this country has seen in generations. Let's talk numbers for a moment. In 2006, before the financial crisis, the median household income was about $58,000. And if you wanted to buy a median-priced home, you needed an income of about $54,000 to qualify for the mortgage. So the typical family could actually afford the typical house. Today, the median income hasn't quite kept pace with inflation, but qualifying for a median-priced home now requires a six-figure household income. We're talking $90,000, $100,000 or more depending on the market. That's not a gap. That's a chasm. And it's a direct result of the Fed's policy of inflating asset prices while wages grow slowly. Young people today are faced with an impossible choice. They can keep their money in savings, where it earns almost nothing and gets eaten alive by inflation. Or they can throw it into the stock market casino and hope they don't buy it right before a crash. There's no safe, steady path to building wealth anymore. The Fed's zero-interest rate policy killed that path. It's what some folks call the saver's penalty. For decades, Americans were taught that thrift was a virtue. You save your money, it grows slowly but safely, and over time, you build a foundation. But when the Fed cuts rates to zero, savings accounts become a joke. You're not building wealth. You're just watching your purchasing power erode. And the biggest penalty of all is housing. We've talked about this, but it bears repeating because it's so fundamental. For most American families, home ownership has been the primary mechanism for building wealth. You buy a house, you pay it off over 30 years, and you end up with an asset worth several times what you paid. That equity becomes your retirement security, the inheritance you leave your kids, the safety net for emergencies. But when housing prices inflate faster than wages, when the Fed's policies push home values up and up while incomes stagnate, that mechanism breaks down. Younger generations get locked out. They pay rent forever, building someone else's equity while their own net worth stays flat or even negative when you account for student loans. It's not laziness. It's not avocado toast. It's policy. It's the direct, predictable consequence of a central bank that prioritizes asset price inflation over broad-based economic opportunity. And then there's the double hit. Not only do younger, lower-income households miss out on the asset boom, they also get slammed by consumer price inflation. Remember that survey I mentioned? 75% of Americans say their monthly household expenses have risen. 40% report their costs have gone up by $500 a month or more. And when asked what's driving that pain, the number one answer wasn't healthcare, wasn't education, wasn't housing. It was groceries, food prices, the most basic necessity. That's where Americans are feeling the squeeze most acutely. And the Fed wants to tell them that inflation is transitory, that it's coming down, that they'll hit 2% in about 2 years, just like they've been promising for the past 4 years. But people live in the real world, not in the Fed's models. They go to the grocery store and see prices that haven't come down. They've just stopped rising quite as fast. That's not the same thing. When milk goes from $3 to $5 and then stays at $5, the Fed calls that victory because the rate of increase has slowed. But families are still paying $5. And here's the bitter irony. The very policy that's supposed to help the economy, cutting rates, printing money, is the policy that guarantees inflation will roar back. You can't flood the system with trillions of dollars and expect prices to stay stable. It doesn't work that way. It's never worked that way. So the forecast for what's coming isn't complicated. The Fed will keep rates low or cut them further. They'll restart quantitative easing when something breaks. That will goose asset prices again. Another boom for anyone holding stocks and real estate. And then, with a lag, inflation will come roaring back. Maybe not in 6 months, but in a year, 2 years, it's almost inevitable. And when it does, the people who were already struggling with $5 milk will be dealing with $6 milk, while the people who own assets will be richer than ever. You know, in my lifetime, I've seen this country do extraordinary things. I've watched us rise from economic depression, fight and win wars, send human beings to the moon, and bring them home safely. Through all of that, there was a belief. Sometimes it was more myth than reality, but it was a powerful myth. That if you worked hard, played by the rules, you could own a piece of the American dream. You could buy a house, raise a family, retire with dignity, maybe leave something for your kids. And that wasn't guaranteed by the markets or by the Federal Reserve. It was made possible by policy choices. Choices about how we structure our economy, who we prioritize, what kind of country we want to be. Today we're making different choices. Maybe not consciously, maybe not explicitly, but we are making them. And those choices are pricing ordinary people out of that dream. Jerome Powell is a smart man. He's well-intentioned. I don't doubt that he's doing what he thinks is necessary. But he's trapped in a system that demands he choose between two bad options. Let the markets seize up and risk a catastrophic financial crisis, or keep printing money and accept permanently high asset prices, persistent inflation, and ever-widening inequality. He's chosen the latter. And he won't say it out loud, but that's the choice. Protect the markets, protect the asset owners, keep the game going. The future we're drifting toward isn't hard to see. It's a country where markets never really fall because the Fed always catches them. But it's also a country where the working class never really rises, where homeownership becomes a luxury, where the gap between those who own assets and those who only sell their labor becomes a permanent feature of the landscape. We'll have managed markets and managed outcomes. But who's being managed out of opportunity? That's the question Powell won't answer in his press conferences. So, what do we do with all this? Well, first, we talk about it. We refuse to let it stay hidden in the technical language of monetary policy and basis points. We call it what it is. If you felt that squeeze in your grocery bill, your rent, your mortgage, your savings account that earns nothing, you're not imagining it. It's real. It's a policy. It's a choice. And it has consequences that will shape this country for decades. I make these videos because I believe conversations like this matter. The more we understand how these systems work, who they serve, and what trade-offs are being made in our name, the harder it becomes for those decisions to be made in the shadows. So, if you found this useful, if it gave you something to think about, or helped you make sense of what you're seeing in your own life, do me a favor, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment. Tell me what you think Powell isn't saying out loud. Tell me what you're seeing in your community, your family, your own finances. Because the more we talk about it, the clearer the picture becomes. And maybe, just maybe, if enough of us see it clearly, we can start asking the right questions of the people making these choices. Until next time, take care of yourselves and each other. And remember, even in fog, we can still choose where to point the headlights.